Hello again, everyone. Thank you for resuming or for joining us for those who are late arriving. Uh, During the intermission, our missing panelist, Kole Olatunde, showed up. So without much ado, we'll go to him for his opening statement.
Okay, thank you very much indeed. It's always very difficult to jump in the midst of a conversation when others have spoken and you're not aware of what they have said. But having said that, I know that a lot of you are aware that when the arrow of God strikes, things fall apart and man is no longer at ease. These are the three books of Achebe in which we put together. And there is something about the man and the way in which he has put his works together. Apart from the fact that we look at the fictional pieces that tend to mirror reality so closely. I mean, as a growing up um, Nigerian in the secondary school, we all felt this book is so simple and we all were going to write our own things fall apart. And I tell you, we attempted it. We all started to write our own things fall apart. But by the fifth page, everything fell apart and we couldn't go beyond of that. It was then our teacher started to tell us that behind every simple text, there is so much complexity and there is a skill and there's something we have to learn, that the text comes in a way to you that it's accessible does not mean that you can write it. And it took us years to abandon that Herculean task of writing our own things fall apart. We never wrote our things fall apart, but with years we started to see that what Achebe had done was to tell our own stories and put on our lips our own way of expressing ourselves. That all we needed to do was to look around us and to take in our own environment and reflect it in our thoughts. The idea of the proverbs that included in it, a lot of people said orality coming into textuality. These are things that mark the African writer, to say that the way we speak and the nature of our speech and the way we tell our stories. I think it was Ngugi Wa Thiong'o that said, sharing stories is like the oxygen of the human spirit. And then I said, what would be the reverse of that? That writing stories is like the carbon dioxide of the human spirit. And the exhaling, that giving out of ideas is the kind of thing that the storyteller is known for. Apart from the fact that Achebe does these very accessible things with his works, there are quite a number of non-academic writers and reviewers that have also said, if you really want to get the thoughts, the ideas of Achebe, you should look at his non-fictional works. He pours himself out in those works when he is writing as Chinua Achebe, as opposed to when he has to create characters to speak. And one of the things that I have done lately is to look at the footprint of Achebe in the academia, to look at how his works. You'll be amazed that in a legal book on land, a woman in New Jersey took some of Achebe's works to use as examples within that work of legal thought, of jurisprudence, to say that the way Achebe had attended to the question of the colonial situation of land, that you could begin to see the difference in the legal jurisprudence of the Igbos and the Western jurisprudence. That these are things that we can learn from. And then you know that in sociology, of course, he's cited all over the place. Even in history, he's cited. And in tragedy studies, the whole idea of Okonkwo killing himself has become a whole seminal work that people are looking at. And I would love to just, if I can quickly, just share um, just share a few of what I had looked at in that area. Um, if I can find it, but even if I can't, you would see that there are there are different kinds of thoughts when it comes to the question of tragedy. You know, um, things fall apart and the study of tragedy. Catherine Poore in 1987 brought to the fore Italy in the 16th century, the golden age of Greece, and 19th century Nigeria. Her concern is that a common literary genre links all three. Romeo and Juliet and Medea or Antigone are all works about tragedy. She says further, and I quote, the bonus accompanying this work is that it allows a class to engage in a mini lesson on the history of the colonization of Africa, especially of Nigeria, and provides a look at a culture unfamiliar to Westerners, end of quote. And that could be found on page 43. This goes to show that Achebe's book, apart from its literary qualities, serve as a means of cross-cultural educational end. To properly situate the text, she observes that in the same way, it can be said that things come together. It can therefore be deduced that Achebe's book, apart from its literary qualities, serves as a means to a cross-cultural educational end. To situate properly the text, she observes that the literary scholars also engaged in a typology of tragedy, classifications of tragedy. The debate the novel generates in classrooms notwithstanding, Richard Begum in 1997, invoking an interview with Chinachebe, gave to Robert Serumaga,
Maga.
states that political implications of tragedy must not be overlooked. A fact remains that African conception of tragedy does not fit the Aristotelian model. And this is Bruce MacDonald in 1980. Other literary scholars classify the tragedy in different ways. Abiola Erele in 1972 as is of the view that it is a cultural and historical tragedy. Afame Belgu in 1983 posits that it is an example of Igbo tragedy, which Alessia Nivan refers to as modern tragedy. The footprints of Chinua Achebe left in this aspect. So books written by Chinua Achebe and other non-Western writers are studied in American schools in different disciplines. The works, particularly Things Fall Apart, fit into areas one would not have thought they might feature. The course developers have found ways of using the different aspects of works to reinforce the otherness of African and non-Western writers. Achebe's footprints have created clear prints in the minds of readers outside his culture. The vivid description of geography of a place and the nature of a pre-modern Igbo society with its own systems of law, philosophy, and ritual practices contributes to the dismantling of preconceived notions. That is just a bit of looking at the footprint of Achebe within the academia in American universities. So let me just give it a stop there before I run out of my time.
Thank you very much, Kole. As a point of personal indulgence, I was extremely touched that you evoked someone I regard as my intellectual grandfather, Abiola Irele, the recently departed Doyen of African Literary Studies. I was quite captivated by your notion, the metaphor of the reading experience is as a kind of oxygen. Uh, but it was kind of jarring that you then attempted to use uh, carbon dioxide, because even as oxygen is a life affirming molecule, carbon dioxide is a toxin. So I'm not sure that would be quite what the writing process would entail. But anyway, it's something we can pick up.
Well, let's you see that is the thing about metaphors. The metaphor of the oxygen is what you take in. The
Yes.
metaphor of carbon dioxide is what you give out. And I usually stick on my wall here something said by Ben Okri about writing and its toxicity. Um, and I think Shoinkad recently also alluded to it in the aesthetics. I think arts and aesthetics, something he's just recently written. Writing does not necessarily have, you can't prescribe it. It can be toxic as well. And I think Ben Okri said something that if you want to poison a nation, you should poison their stories, which means that, yes, but I am looking at carbon dioxide as exhaling when you give
Okay.
out. Writing is about giving out. And but
Well,
again, it's open to all of it. Sharing stories is like oxygen. It gives life. It's the taking in. When we share stories, it's something that we have taken in, and when we give out, it's in writing. But like I agree with you, we
the
can
point is well
you can
made,
disagree with it.
and as much as I am a great fan of intellectual uh, debate and disputation, when Stanley, you began your remarks, I was bracing for swift and severe rhetorical rebuke, and was kind of touched that you were casting a protective hug around me, uh,
Yes.
and which allows me to make the remark about one of the most jarring part of Obama's rhetorical performance, talking about writing as a toxin, is when he pays homage to Dr. King, who in the famous Riverside Address, A Time for Reckoning, came to make this speech that seriously compromised his position within the civil rights movement, making him exist uneasily with it in much of the same way as Baldwin, by coming out fiercely against the Vietnam War and saying
Absolutely.
that the US is the greatest purveyor of terrorism in the world, and saying that uh, he's, that one cannot be ethical until they have learned to look at the world from the perspective not of the self but of the other. And in an extraordinary, achingly beautiful and uh, haunting rhetorical performance, he begins to say, what does the world look like from the perspective of a typical Vietnamese villager? Or even more bravely, what does the world look like from the perspective of the demonized Viet Cong? And in Obama's taking of it, in Obama's homage to it, he embarks on this Pax Americana apology that becomes a justification for a the brutalization of racialized bodies in the Middle East, and a campaign that I think we can call a genocide in Yemeni. And this allows me to perhaps provoke the more conversation by turning to you, Zahir. Your comments were probably a little too terse, and I wonder, you are navigating uh, intersectionality and the complex ways in which systems of oppressions and domination coexist uneasily with each other. And you have mentioned about how to talk about religion, particularly in this moment of white Christian nationalist reach and reinforcement. And I wonder, in terms of your craft, how that manifests.
Sure. So I was particularly speaking about in the paper that I wrote, looking at Baldwin's lovely essay in which he looks at the Nation of Islam, where he goes and interviews Elijah Muhammad. And I feel like I think one of the things that I found so interesting upon rereading that book recently was the ways in which he uh, take sort of a critical examination, particularly about the gender politics within the Nation of Islam. And I feel like that was, for me in my own craft, as someone who's working on a novel about the Muslim pilgrimage to Makkah, Saudi Arabia, and I've been looking for writers who can help me navigate how to sort of explore themes of religion. I keep returning to James Baldwin. And so my paper is really sort of more exploring like why Baldwin doesn't come up often as a guide to help us explore questions of religion. So that to me, I think is, because I think what I find so remarkable about the way Baldwin explores these questions is the way he does it with such incredible empathy. So even in that exchange that he has with Elijah Muhammad, it's a sort of very sort of playful way in which he writes about, I think, the way in which the women are sitting separately from the men. And I really love that scene in that essay of his. So that to me was interesting. But also, you know, I spent most of my December break before COVID in Turkey, and I kept meeting writers, both Turkish writers and as well as writers from other parts of the world who are living in Istanbul, who owed great debt to James Baldwin. And partly it's just because of the ways in which themes of religion, even if they're not explicitly invoked, come up so often in his writing. And so there's this notion of the ways in which even the quote unquote secular writing has a profundity to it, has a sense of the sacred to it. And that I find quite beautiful. And I think like part of the reasons why I find Baldwin resonates every time I travel, particularly in the Middle East, is people who really resonate with Baldwin for so many reasons. But one of them is because those themes of faith are so central, even post-faith are central in his writings. And I found that quite moving. So that was what I was trying to explore.
Thank you very much. And there was something I was going to mention about Kole's talk also. I appreciated your emphasizing um, the importance of appreciating Achebe as a rhetorician. He is a breathtakingly brilliant essayist, which James Baldwin was in his own right, and that their craft extends beyond fiction, and they have this rhetorical performance in terms of in terms of non-fictional writing. Okay, I meant to also apologize for interrupting you towards the end of your presentation, which was extremely rich and informative in terms of paying homage to the humanity and generosity of Achebe. And it seemed particularly vulgar to interrupt you at the moment when you were making uh, really important remarks about the fierce urgency of the moment we are living and the brutalization of Black bodies, both in the African continent uh, and in the United States. And I hope we'll be able to generate more conversation around that, and especially the task of the writer to bear witness to this moment.
Okay.
And um,
Can I
but
just add one more thing, if I may? I guess another thing too. I'm just finding this essay about Baldwin. I think part of the thing, especially as the election comes up, these last 4 years have been about so many things, about racism, misogyny, but also about an intense amount of Islamophobia.
mhm,
And I think for me, as a Muslim American writer, one of the things that there's a professor at Michigan, Samar Ali, who runs an Islamophobia group on campus, like to combat Islamophobia, and he says Islamophobia wins either when you write perfect Muslim characters or when you write deeply like just and or you write the sort of tropey Muslim characters. And I feel like Baldwin has also given me a way in which to not run away from these difficult conversations around faith. And I feel like part of, to me, the challenge about being a writer of color, being a Muslim American writer in a time of such intense Islamophobia is finding a language in which I can be critical about aspects of faith, but also not fit into those tropes. And for me, that's why I keep returning back to James Baldwin. And I know this is sort of a cliche, but I feel like Baldwin gets away with so much because he has such an immense amount of love in his writing. And that to me is what I'm really trying to sort of capture in my own, is that if you write with such an intense amount of love, and I don't know how to sort of explain that as from a craft perspective, I just know it when I see it, and I know it when it's not there. But I feel like even when Baldwin is very critical of, let's say, the Nation of Islam or the church, he does it with such love. And I feel like that to me is where, when I travel and people are rereading and rereading James Baldwin in Turkey, especially given that there's this Islamicization of Turkey going on, and I just posted in the chat, I think Baldwin gives us a way out of saying, hey, you don't have to retreat from these conversations. You could just tackle them with more empathy, with more love. And so that's what I really owe to Baldwin.
Thank you very much. And that's kind of what I was trying to get you to address. So I'm glad you brought it up. And I should say that anyone in the panel can feel free to interject at any point in our conversation. And I continue to encourage the audience to send me questions. There's a question that I will be turning to shortly. But and I guess I want to go first to Julie, again, to make you talk a little bit more about craft, especially as you began to engage with the binary that I self-consciously set up. How do you deal with those questions in the difficult moment we are living?
Yeah. Well, first of all, I want to say, Zahir, I thought that that was very, very beautifully stated. I think that as writers, we're in this position where we need to speak for our communities, but we also need to speak to our communities. And I think that there's sometimes a danger where we don't speak to our own communities, we speak to others. And so there are things that we need to talk about, that we need to be critical of, for example. And sometimes there's a fear that you can't be able to explore the many facets of our own communities, of our own humanity, right? And so we're kind of limited in presenting ourselves as these positive archetypes. So I think that's one of the things that I think about all the time. So in my positionality, I would say this conference has been really, really illuminating for me in a lot of ways. I'm Nigerian of Igbo descent, but I was born and raised in the US. And I know there's a generation of others like me who are also in this really interesting position, having inherited these histories from the continent and going back to visit and things like that, but also being in the US and understanding race and colonization through that lens as well. And so one of the things, I think one of the tragedies of that particular, that movement in my own family was we weren't taught how to speak Igbo language. So that was something that I had to seek out on my own. I'd been interested in that as a child. And then as an adult, taking classes and learning. One of the things that I came across when I was going back to Chinua Achebe's work as an adult was really thinking about his aesthetics and the ways in which the Igbo language is encoded in the way that he explores metaphor, simile, images, all of those kinds of things. It's so encoded, and just learning how the grammatical structures work, learning about how the words, there's so much poetry in the language. When one describes, when someone says their heart, it's a seed in their chest, right? When they talk about a book is the leaves of life, right? So you think about that kind of way of seeing the world, that kind of orientation, and how that then is evidenced in these pages. And again, the book is written mostly in English. That was something for me that became so interesting and something that I've been very much interested in terms of my own aesthetic, thinking about the ways in which my own writing itself, the words that I choose, how I see the world, how all of that is inflected by my experience being someone who, what I consider as a Nigerian American. But also at the same time, what are the limitations of that, right? So I think in terms of that question of this dichotomy between this imperative, this sort of moral imperative, and then also this aesthetic sort of question of just writing for writing's sake, and then this very crucial moment that we're in as witnesses to all the things that are going on, I think that we have an important role. I think we do have an important role to be here to explore things and to write about them and to illuminate and to highlight things. But I think we also have this danger, and I think others have mentioned this as well. There's a way in which you can write on a script, right? A script that has been handed to you. And I think that one of the cautions, one of the things that I think about, in some ways, distance allows you to do this, right? If you are distanced from that moment, I think it's important to write about this moment, but I also think it's important to be able to explore it from multiple angles and to be careful not to kind of write these kind of scripted narratives about what's happening in this moment, to really, really look for those moments, those areas, those experiences that aren't being talked about, because I think that's what Baldwin and Achebe were doing in their time. I mean, they were seeing and exploring and talking about things that hadn't been said before, and that's why their work has so much power even today.
And I would
May I,
invite,
may I interject
yes,
for a second
Stanley.
about that? I recently I got this book of Toni Morrison's work. It is one of I can't name it. I can't think of the name of the book, but it's filled with her essays and some of her talks. And I stumbled across a section about she had written this little short section about Achebe, and in it it was talking about Baldwin also. And when you were just now mentioning about the aesthetics, um, Toni Morrison said that she owes a debt of a gift that Achebe gave her. And she goes on to talk about how Baldwin said that he felt like he did not really understand or know how to, I guess, articulate the English language. He felt like he was just mimicking the language and he did not know how to express it. It was full of these, it was almost foreign because it was full of these, I guess, Eurocentric soul to it. And what Achebe did was you were talking about all these Igbo references and the aesthetics of it. She attributed her ability to write from a different perspective. I guess she came into herself and embraced, I guess, the ancestral Africanness. I just made that up. If that's something, but I I can't really articulate it. But I guess the easiest way is to say it gave it a soul, an authentic soul that she was able to express herself. And Baldwin says the same thing about being able to express himself and actually use the English language in a way that it served him how he could basically express himself, the aesthetics of it, as you mentioned, the orientation of it. It gave it a soul to it. And he was no longer just mimicking English language, he was actually using it. So, I mean, does that make sense? What I just said?
And
Yeah, and
yes, Terry.
sorry. I was just going to say, one of the things that I particularly love about Baldwin is the fact that when I'm reading him, I'm so for example, like the excerpt that I read yesterday, I felt like I was walking in the Harlem neighborhood. The words that he chooses so carefully, and they paint a very, very vivid picture of what he's talking about. And so with Baldwin and Achebe, I find that I'm almost transported into the story. And so their use of the English language, in combination with the use of the language of the people that they are writing about, is to me just so profound, and it's a great blueprint for me as I try to create my own way in the world as a writer.
Now, Major and Oki, if you have something to add to this question of bearing witness and the pitfalls of intersectionality that Zahir and Julie have spoken so succinctly about, but I will also read a question that has come to us from Ayokumni Ojebade, who is joining us from Ajayi Crowther University in Nigeria. Can we glean some clues from Achebe and Baldwin that impact on public policies, especially with regard to peace and conflict? Eh, Major, okay, this question
Yeah,
bearing
well,
witness and what lessons these two writers may have for us.
sure. Well, first I want to say, what's beautiful about this historic or us recognizing the meeting of these two great writers um, is owed to the fact that there's a long tradition of in conversation around diasporic unity and the possibility of a Pan-Africanist world. And that's what we're kind of celebrating. That's what's underneath this. And yet, We have to acknowledge that the political valence of one's writing is owed to a very, very personal growth. And it's not something that can be scripted. It has to come through voluminous self-interrogation, um, attention to one's particular craft, and it becomes something that one arrives at. I think early Baldwin is a different kind of thinker than a late Baldwin. And yet we should not, which is what we're tempted to do by this conversation of whether or not writing for writing's sake, separating aesthetics from the politics. We should not disentangle. I mean, it's a very, very personal growth. And it's something that as models, I've been thinking about these two writers, one whom I did meet, Achebe, some time ago, that I talked about in a poem that I read. It was through, how did I arrive there? Oh, Sonia Sanchez had invited me to a reading that she was giving at Bard College. And because of traffic coming through New York City, we were late. And yet here was this man, when we arrived, she went immediately on stage, and here was this man on stage in a wheelchair. And it was then that she said, great gratitude and so thrilled to see my brother, Chinua Achebe. She never mentioned that we were going to see him. So when we arrived, here he is, there's the reading. And then afterwards, I sat at their feet, these two monuments, and listened and learned and understood about a Pan-Africanist vision from the perspective of a writer. And so what I enjoyed about listening to them, and what I imagined happened between Baldwin and Achebe, is just the deep pride that they had in one another, the sensibility of kindness and understanding and recognition despite their experiences, as one a Black woman from Alabama and Achebe from Nigeria. I inherited that as a young writer. That was part of my particular growth. And we need to recognize that, going back to something that Julie said, technology allows that vision to come into actuality. There are a number of writers across continents for whom I feel as though my work is speaking directly to their particular concerns. Something else that we inherit from them, and something that I feel like is a question of maturity for young writers, not only a political valence, but the inseparability of one's personal life and one's life on the page. And that radical connection is something that you grow into. I'm galvanized by the tensions as well in that, whether it's a kind of personal valence that is owed to one's writing oneself to consciousness, and writing oneself to a kind of deep moral, spiritual understanding of oneself in the world. That was ultimately my great takeaway from that very brief encounter with Achebe, was this deep wisdom. And I hate to, Zahir invoked it, but I sensed such a huge amount of care and love from my mentors, both on the page and those who I met in life, including Achebe. I want to bring up something that Baraka said about Jimmy that I think can be applied and maybe answer this question about political valence in one's writing. Baraka said, for Jimmy, spirit was the animating reality of our living consciousness and relationship to the world. It was the thing that made us human or not. And I think that idea of the writer helping to dignify and humanize each other or their communities, I think is something that goes back to your question.
Thank you. I
Yes.
briefly misheard you, and I thought you were saying I want to bring up something Barack said about Baldwin. So I was kind of jarred, but thank you.
Baraka.
So
Baraka.
you have something to say, and then I'll just kind of open up to whoever wants to join the discussion.
Okay, well, when Baldwin and Achebe met 40 years ago, there was something that Baldwin said to Achebe that we were never supposed to meet. In other words, the forces that had sundered these two siblings had construed for them a path or two parallel paths that were not ever supposed to meet. So the act of them meeting in Gainesville was a radical transgression of the original intent, to keep these two brothers apart. And so this sort of points me to an imperative, I think, that here you have the vast continent of Africa. And then on the other side, in the diaspora, you have millions of people of African descent who are actually doing wonderful things. I mean, despite all the constraints of history and the oppression that has come with it, that the story of triumph is, in fact, the most impressive narrative, the most impressive story that we have to tell. So I think that there's a synergy here waiting to be consummated, that ultimately part of the reclamation of the promise of Africa must come from the joining of forces, the meeting of siblings who were long separated and who were never, ever meant to re-meet. And in that sense, I'm going to tell a quick story of something that played out in Côte d'Ivoire, in Abidjan, in 1991. So the late Leon Sullivan had convened the first, what was called the first African and African American Summit. And I was editing this African magazine in this country, and I went to cover that event. And I was at Hotel Ivoire in Abidjan when the first bus from the airport that brought in the African American delegation arrived. And an African American sister stepped out from the bus, walked into the hotel lobby, saw an Ivorian woman standing there. And this African American woman just went straight to her and held her in an embrace, this stranger. And both women started slapping each other's back, and both of them just dissolved in tears. And the African American woman was saying to this African woman, "You are my sister, you are my sister." And the African woman was speaking to her in French, which I don't speak. But it was such a magical moment. And I say, this is what happened when Achebe and Baldwin met. And this is what needs to happen, that we need to continue to meet despite the divisions of language, despite even cultural divisions, but that the energies that we bring, the people of Africa on the continent and our brothers and sisters in the diaspora, we need to meet and transform and change our world.
All right, comments from the rest of the panel.
Well, I was just going to come in to say the theme of this conference is commemorate and interrogate. I think we've done a very good job of commemorating and also taking a stab at interrogating. It's been 40 years since Baldwin and Achebe met. And I agree that that meeting was sponsored. It was something in which somebody must have made to happen. In the 40 years that have passed, what can we say about how much the African Americans, especially those who were born here, and the Africans from the continent, how much understanding of ourselves have we attempted at all? How much of ourselves have we confronted? There is always, when writers meet, and that was the question I was going to ask, which Achebe met Baldwin? Was it the Achebe, the writer, that met Baldwin? Or was it Achebe, the African, that met Baldwin? Because in their talk that I have listened to, they were both on the level of writerly brothers. I was wondering if an ordinary Joe had met Baldwin, what would have been the situation and what would have been the direction of thought? In present day, in this 2020, how many African Americans actually are meeting with Africans at the level at which Baldwin and Achebe met? How much of ourselves are we pouring out there? Once, I think 2 months ago, I had an opportunity of giving a talk, and the very first thing that came out of my mouth is that we need a global forgiveness period in which Africans and African Americans, we need to come together. I feel inside of me each time I come across an African American that we're holding back something. Except when a person like Skip Gates comes out with Wonders of Africa, and you begin to see it all hang out. The fact that you sold us into slavery. And it's such an uncomfortable discussion to have, that we have not come together to look at each other and say, look, things have happened. Where do we go from here? How much of ourselves do we collaborate with at all levels? And this, for me, is something that we can pretend as if it's not there. We can pretend as if the African American brother who is on this panel and is listening to me even understands where I'm coming from, understands the baggage I carry, understands the way America has treated me. Because it is always said, yes, when America wants the tokenist black, they go for somebody from the African continent. And you would know it too, that of recent, some of the actors in Britain who are black, who have gotten roles here, there have been movements to say, stop them. Why should they be taking the job from us? I think in interrogating this moment where Achebe and Baldwin met, it's for me, the uncomfortableness of that period was sort of glossed over, because these were two iconic writers that were meeting, and they probably they were not able to get into the nitty-gritty of what I'm saying.
So
Thank you,
Kole
Kole.
and Okey have gone in interestingly contrasting directions. And I don't know what the rest of the panel has to.
I would like to say something to that, because I am so glad that Brother Kole brought that up, because it was stirring in me a little bit, but I did not know how to. It is a very sensitive subject, and I did not know how to, I guess, articulate it. What I am, and there is something, a movement going on right now. I'm not sure exactly too familiar with it, but it's called ADOS. It's African Descendants of slaves, and it basically, and there's another movement that embraces Pan Africanism, and this other movement, ADOS, I guess it's more separating Black Americans from their African brothers and sisters. And and then I navigate certain spaces, and you hear these things about there is a rift, or some rift between African Americans and Africans from the continent. And I'm not sure where it comes from. Maybe it comes from that part about you sold your brother into slavery, or sister into slavery. Maybe it comes from there. I don't know, but I know it exists. And I know I hear whispers of it. I have not experienced it myself. I've met Brother Kole. I love him. I think he's a wonderful, wonderful, wonderful person. He
Mhm.
participates in Art Speak sometimes, and I miss him. But I'm glad you brought that up, and I was going to ask Julie about it because she kind of navigates both worlds, and I was going to ask you, did you have a sense about that conversation? Did you would like to share?
Yeah, I mean, absolutely, and absolutely. As someone who was born and raised in the U.S., I certainly am in that. I see myself as being in that intersection. I think the issue is even more complicated. I feel like I look more African, if that's a way to phrase it. And so there's always a question of where are you from, right? But I think the answer to where you're from is very complicated because if I'm I get asked that question in Nigeria too. So, and
Mhm.
I've been asked, I've been pinned as Senegalese and Kenyan and Ghanaian, and so in some ways, I think I am very Pan African, right? Because I kind of represent, and people from those countries will come to me and start speaking to me in their language. So for sure, there's that part of it. But I do think, in terms of that kind of that tension that exists between Africans from the continent and African Americans, I absolutely do think it is an issue that remains. And I have wondered a great deal about what that meant. I think symbolically, there was a lot in that gesture between Baldwin and Achebe meeting together and sharing so much in terms of the work. But I do also wonder about what that looks like in terms of the everyday experience of people. I live in Chicago, and Chicago's a very segregated city, as you all know. Um, and in some parts of Chicago, you see mostly Africans living like on the north side, and then you see many African Americans who live historically on the south side of Chicago. But there are these meeting spaces, and I think that there is a lot of hope. And I think, particularly with my generation, um, the Black Lives Matter movement, for example, is a good example of this. Right now, in this moment, Black Lives Matter has been claimed by so many people around the globe. Even though it started here in the U.S., it's become a banner for exploring what it means to be, a Black person in the world, and how and so the way that we speak about oppression and persecution isn't necessarily specific to whiteness, because, for example, with the NSARS movement right now, the perpetrators of the violence are not white people, right? So I think that there are many different claims to Blackness, and so one of the things that I'm really interested in my work is global Blackness. What does it mean to be a Black person moving through the world? What kind of conversations do you have with one another about the things that are happening? And then how does that sort of frame our aesthetics in the work that we produce as creative writers and thinkers as well? But I think there's much work to be done. And what I would say, something that I would urge people to do, because I know that there are lots of people who are watching, is for those on the other side. So right now, what's happening with NSARS, I think we need a lot of help from people. So a lot of African Americans, a lot of people from different parts of the world to join that movement as well. And the same ways that people were electrified and mobilized around the killing of George Floyd and others in the US.
Just to give a
Thank
quick
you. Thank you,
example
Julie.
to this tension that we are talking about, shortly after Kamala Harris was nominated, there was a movement in the right-wing media space that was making the claim that she is not actually Black because she is not descended from slaves, which is a preposterous claim given that her father is Jamaican. But it also happened when Obama was running for the Senate in Illinois, when the Republican Party went and found a Black man to run against him. And Alan Keyes would say he's not really Black because he's not descended from slaves. So that's one particularly ugly and grotesque way in which race uh, and a tension between Africanness and African Americanness plays. But I interrupted Major, who wanted to say something. Then we'll come to you, Stanley.
Okay.
Yeah, I'll be brief. I just very simply want to say I appreciate the tenor of this question. I appreciate the historiosity of it. But maybe it's owed to my work as an editor and also as a teacher, particularly someone in graduate MFA programs, conferences. Um, and also, let me say, friendships and mentorships. I have not experienced that uncomfortableness. I have not experienced that tension. Um, uh, I think of my brother Neon Sadari. I think of Patricia Jabba Wesley. I think of the young poets coming through, Kwame Dawes and Chris Abani and Matthew Shinoda's African poetry series. I think of my young brother over in England, Enua Elams, Bernadine of Aristo. It's just so many writers today. My dearly late brother, Benyavinga. I do not feel that tension, and there's always been something that when I said I sat with Sonia and Achebe and watched this spirit of recognition, and it wasn't without difficult conversations, no doubt, but I definitely feel as though we might be bringing some of that energy into this conversation, in which I feel like there's been multiple generations of writers, Adichie and others, who have modeled, I'm going to use Julie's term, a kind of global Blackness, individuated, not scripted, individuated in their level of consciousness. I'm thinking of students of mine, Dalia Al-Hassan and Gabinga Adesina. It's just so many young writers coming up today for whom they acknowledge and understand the complexity of their existence right now, today, and not as something that is owed to a conversation we had
Thank you
in the
very much,
past.
Major. I think that's a really important interjection. We are running over, but I want to make room for Stanley, and then if Terry and Zahir have something to say.
Yes, and thank you, Major. I personally have never experienced that tension myself. One of my teachers, who uh, I called him a teacher, but I actually he was my I worked for him. One of my in sales, he was happened to be a Yoruba priest, and I attribute him for reshaping my Eurocentric mind as a young man, and totally changed the way that I thought about the world and myself. He brought me into my Africanness, so to speak. But what I want to say is for us to remember where we are. This is America, and one of the things I'm thinking about right now is a COINTELPRO program, and what these forces do. And when you pull the cover back on ADOS and some of these other movements that I guess profess to be, uh, you see a Black American, African American face to it. If you look deep, you will find these right wing, far right think tanks at the core of it. And so I think a lot of this is being manipulated by covert forces in an effort to keep African Americans apart from their brothers and sisters from the African continent, because there is so much power or unity when we do finally come together and liberate ourselves here in America and from the African continent. And I think that's the core. That's at the core of that rift that we're talking about right now.
So we'll
Not
have some closing thoughts by Terry and Zahir.
I just wanted to say that one of the things my organization does, Bailey Learn and Arts Collective, um, is we try to bring together Black people and other people um, from all walks of life, from all nations. And we really work hard to make sure that we understand each other. So, as a person who practices African traditional religion, we had a workshop the other night in which Kole came and talked to us about um, some of the key components, like good character, and also address some of the language issues. I brought in film from about Black women in Cuba and from about Black women in Brazil. I just think it's important for us as artists to always do our best to bridge that gap, because I have experienced that, where you get that level of hate. I've had a African sister say that I'm lazy because I'm Black American, you know. But then on the other hand, I've had Black American friends say some really degrading things about African people, and be shocked about their level of intelligence. And so I think that as the artists, we one of the premises that we do everything in, me and my husband Tabata, is art is for life's sake. So as writers and visual artists, and even Stanley stage performers, it's important that we do the best that we can in bringing all of the stories together, and for me, stressing the commonality more than the difference.
Thank you. Zahir.
Yeah, I just want to I appreciate the the comments that Kole mentioned, but I want to echo what Major Jackson said. I was really lucky in undergrad to be the TA for one of the TAs for June Jordan, who had such a huge impact on me, continues to have impact on me years after her passing. And I was just looking up online. June Jordan wrote this fabulous poem, I believe published in 1980. I'll post it in the chat. Poem for South African Women. And June Jordan published this book. I think it's called The Revolutionary Imprint, I think, for poetry or something. I forgot the title. But to me, what was so revolutionary about June Jordan was not just the decentering of whiteness, not just the exploration of queerness, but also the international aspect of how she thought about poetry, how she thought about writing. So as an undergrad, she pushed us to read Chinese poets, Arab poets, poets from all across Africa. She would bring them off into class. Now, one of my critiques wasn't with June, but was the way in which reporters, oftentimes white reporters, would write about June. So people would come to June and be like, "Oh, so you're really close with Alice Walker. You're really close with," but they would never talk about her kinship, her friendships with a lot of the African poets who would come to our class. And they would oftentimes narrowly define her. I mean, even if you look at the obituary written about her in the New York Times, I think that it's called Rage, about her last book. So I feel like the problem wasn't often, I think, with June Jordan herself. It was just the ways in which the conversations. Now those conversations have changed today, as I think the different people are writing, which is very positive. But to me, what I really got from June Jordan was, especially as a non-Black POC writer, was about the debt that I owe to a lot of Black writers, about the foundation that Black American writers did, but then also June would always remind us about this foundation that existed from writers from the African continent. So she brought it up really often. I'll post this to her chat, but I mean, I think she was very much in conversation. I wish it was more. I wish there was more conversation. I think there's more room for improvement, but I feel like this history has really been there for some time, as Major pointed out.
Thank you very much. And I think that would be a fitting place to bring to a close what I affectionately designated the impossible panel. I am very grateful to the authors who have risen to the task of generating a stimulating intellectual conversation. I would inform audience members, if they don't already know, that the authors' biographies are available on the website. I did not feel that I had the time to devote to giving them justice and introducing them properly. I apologize. And even though I cannot see you, I truly appreciate you all bearing witness to our conversation. I hope it was of value to you. And I look forward to encountering you all remotely in the student panels that come this afternoon. Bye for
Major,
now.
Thank you.
Major, I've met most of your stuff.
Thank you.
Oh,
This has been
Stanley,
such an
thank
honor.
you, brother. Thank you,
It's such an
man.
honor.